What was Milton Friedman's impact on the libertarian movement? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another Libertarian Angle.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners once more.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for around 32 years of principled articles, videos, speeches, lectures, conferences on libertarianism. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we have long strived to make the best libertarian daily commentary page on the internet. Our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, which includes a monthly article by Richard and myself, along with James Bovard and Lawrence Vance and others. And of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel and purchase my new book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. So, Richard, periodically during the past several months, we've profiled some giants in the libertarian movement, historical giants. And so I thought maybe we ought to discuss an economist that has played a big role in both of our lives and the lives of many, many other libertarians, and that's Milton Friedman. Friedman, of course, is the winner of the Nobel Prize in economics, or was. He's now deceased. But when I first discovered just had such a remarkable impact on me because it was oriented toward the regular person. I mean, Friedman had that ability to speak to academic audiences, and there's any number of books and monographs and articles he's written which are way over my head. I mean, it's very, very academically oriented. The guy was obviously a genius, but he could also write for popular lay audiences, and that's where he has such a profound impact on me, is that I could understand difficult economic issues because Friedman knew how to bring them down to the average lay educated person. And then he made that fantastic series called Free to Choose, that it was a television series. I think it may have been on PBS, I'm not sure. But I mean, week after week, I was just mesmerized by the series. It was explaining difficult concepts to regular audiences, and he just had this unique ability to do that. The one that stands out for me is when he went into Hong Kong and started talking about free trade in Hong Kong, that here is this island, not an island, but it's sort of like a rock, a real rock. There's no automobile industry. There's no big industries, because you often hear, oh, well, you have to have an automobile industry if you're going to be a great nation and all this. Hong Kong didn't have anything, except that they had free enterprise, genuine free enterprise with virtually no regulations on economic activity. And they were among the most prosperous societies in the world. Not so much anymore, of course, because they've been taken over by the Chinese communists, who are imposing their concept of central planning on Hong Kong. But I mean, Friedman was able to just explain things so clearly and so succinctly. So let me turn it over to you as the economist. Give us your perspective on Friedman, and then when I come back, I'll talk a little bit about some personal experiences with the man. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, as you were helping to summarize, Friedman is probably one of the most well-known classic liberal, libertarian, free market-oriented economists of the 20th century, and certainly the second half of the 20th century. He was born in New York in 1912 of immigrant parents who had come from Imperial Russia originally. He died in 2006. He studied at both the University of Chicago and at Columbia University in New York. He ended up working for the US government during the Second World War. And according to the joint autobiography that he wrote with his wife, Rose Friedman, who also was a very notable economist and thinker in her own right, though in the shadow of her husband. She mostly sort of like worked behind and co-authored some things with him. She says that it was his time during the Second World War, serving in the U.S. government, that resulted in him undertaking a policy proposal, in helping to institute a policy proposal, for which she never forgave him. And that was that before the Second World War, there hadn't since 1913 a federal income tax. But the federal income taxes was paid in a lump sum in the middle of April. And so everybody had to account for what they had earned, and they had to send in a lump sum once a year to the federal government. Most people did. But with the coming of the war, the government needed a much more regular inflow of revenues to cover its war expenses, besides, of course, the deficit spending that it also undertook to cover the war expenses. And Friedman, I gather, had proposed the withholding tax. Yes, have the employer withhold money from themselves and the employees based upon a scale of how much an individual on average would owe during the year if he paid a lump sum, but to give the government a regular monthly or bi-monthly stream of income. And of course, that changed how people looked at the income tax. As I like to say, I would like it reverting to that once a year, but I would do it not on April 15th, but I would suggest that everybody has to pay a lump sum of what they owe to the government, as long as there's an income tax in effect, the Tuesday before the November election. So that you've had to send this humongous check to the federal government for the entire year, the week before you go and vote on that second Tuesday of November or whatever it is. And that would make people very conscious of what the hell government is costing and doing before you pull the lever, and maybe more of the rascals would be thrown out. That doesn't assure that better people will get in, but don't let them stay there, because you'll be so upset you won't want them to have a second or third term. Anyway, but Friedman was one of those who helped institute, as a policy matter, proposing the withholding tax, which was meant to be a wartime emergency. And like most wartime emergencies, it never went away. The war was over. And she said she never forgave him, because now people don't even think about what the government is taking, right? When you're hired, you might be told, oh, this is the pay we're offering you. But you become so desensitized with taking for granted that your salary is what your take-home pay is after the taxes have been deducted, and you either get your paycheck or your direct deposit. You lose consciousness of what on a regular paycheck basis the government is costing you, unless you look at the stub. But in the years after the Second World War, Friedman ended up teaching in several places, but he ended up basically at the end of the day at the University of Chicago, and as a professor there. And in that position, along with some of the older members of what was an earlier Chicago School of Economics, Frank H. Knight, Jacob Viner, he and then another prominent free market economist who also later won the Nobel Prize, George Stigler, basically helped to create what is known as the modern Chicago School of Economics, a focus on empirical studies backed by theory and evidence to demonstrate the efficacy of the market economy, as well as in principle to show any weaknesses if the theory and the evidence suggest so. And that on that basis, to be able to make more informed policy proposals and decisions about if a certain goal is in mind, what would be the most efficacious policy to introduce. As a result of this, Friedman had an immense influence with several generations of graduate students who went through the University of Chicago economics program, molding them in a way that they all came to be suspicious on, in other words, of taking it just on faith or assertion, that there were failures in the marketplace that required government corrections. So Friedman, with his eloquence, his persuasiveness, his way to make things simple in the sense of easily understood in the classroom as well as in his public presentations, helped create an entire generation of market-oriented economists in that post-World War II period when Keynesianism and the idea of the interventionist welfare state as considered the default position by many other economists was taken for granted. He's perhaps most well known as a formal or technical economist for a series of works. One is called The Theory of the Permanent Income Hypothesis. That was a book that he wrote in the mid-1950s which was basically a critique of Keynes, about the relationship between income and consumption. Very technical matter, but it basically challenged fundamental assumptions behind Keynes's theory. But then what was considered his major work that really made his fame as a monetary theorist and a monetary historian was a book that he co-authored with another very good economist named Anna Schwartz, called A Monetary History of the United States, which came out in 1963. And this covered the period from 1865, the end of the American Civil War, to the early 1960s when he was publishing this volume. And it basically demonstrates, both upon a basic theory of the quantity theory of money and the historical evidence, that inflations have inescapably been linked to, connected with, and basically caused by increases in the money supply. And that the pattern of booms and busts in the business cycle is basically also inseparably connected with government mismanagement of the money supply, accelerating it, slowing it down, accelerating it, slowing it down, which cause these business cycle patterns from which the economy suffers. Friedman's point, therefore, was that it's not necessarily the case that you have to have these severe upturns and downturns of the boom and the bust, though there may be certain forces in the market that creates waves of certain types. But it is the government's own monetary policies that historically have exacerbated the amplitude, the severity of it, as well as constantly set the stage through discretionary policy of the monetary managers attempting to sort of constantly change policy based upon what they're seeing as the wind blowing at a particular time. Therefore, what he proposed at a time when Keynesianism was riding high was the end to discretionary monetary policy by the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and that the Federal Reserve should follow a monetary rule. And as he expressed it in a book on a program for monetary reform in the early 1960s, he basically said is that the economy grows on average and in general, looking at the long historical data, about 2.5%, 3% a year. So increases in money supply should not be open to the arbitrary discretion of central bank authorities. It should be put like on automatic pilot. A steady increase in the money supply of, again, 3% a year to match real growth in the economy, which would, in the consumer price index sense, basically keep the general level of prices fairly stable. And that would at least eliminate the monetary causes for instability in the economy. At the time, this was extremely controversial. It ran against what was about over 2 decades of Keynesian dominance, that the market economy is inherently unstable, it's irrational, it often and frequently falls into periods of severe downturns of recessions, or even like the 1930s, the Great Depression, does not have the ability to get out of it on its own, and the government must have a wide array of monetary and fiscal policy tools to just constantly be turning the dial, pushing the button, gradation, the factors in the economy to try to restore and maintain stability through government's hand constantly being on the monetary and the fiscal levers. And Friedman said, no, the market is inherently stable, has self-correcting responses through competition and price adjustments, and that if you keep government out, there may still be other things going on in the economy that disrupt things for periods of time, but you will be minimizing the damage that historically it is government intrusions in the economy that has been the major source of our economic problems. this, after having done these, quote, serious works in the eyes of the profession, he also focused a lot of his time on popularizing these economic ideas, as you were saying. In 1962, he published a book called Capitalism and Freedom, the opening essay of which I think is sort of a classic. It's on the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom. That if we wish to keep a society free, it is inescapable that we also keep a society grounded in the institutions and workings of a free market economy. It is capitalism that decentralizes authority. It is capitalism, the free market, that gives people the autonomy and liberty as consumer and producer to make their own decisions, guided by their own justimates and estimates of the best course of action for themselves in the setting of buying and selling, producing and consuming in the competitive market, that keeps individuals' autonomy from the controlling hand of the government. And that chapter itself, which opens the book, is practically a classic on that theme. The rest of the book, he lays out a series of policy proposals. His monetary rule, his notion of what he called automatic stabilizers for fiscal or government spending and taxing policies, and then a whole series of more controversial ones that has had a degree of divisiveness among classical liberals and libertarians. His case for school vouchers, his analysis of a negative income tax, which basically ends up being a form of like this guaranteed annual income that has become an issue today, though not quite in the form he was talking about. And other ways of using the market as solutions to the government, but the government has a hand. In other words, while having the image of being a laissez-faire economist, Friedman actually was not. His ideal was a free economy, but he believed that given the institutional settings and the circumstances, the political currents, what you needed to do was to use the market with the government being a force less intrusive and less disruptive, but while enabling people choices, given that he took it for granted, certain things the government was doing was not going to go away. Public schools, for instance, or just going back to a gold standard or commodity money, or the government stopping the income tax. So this was his attempts to sort of reach market solutions within the existing government interventionist institutional setting. And that's been controversial among many classical liberals and libertarians since then, which we could talk about. But I just want to say one more thing, a couple of more things, to highlight. You had mentioned his television series, Free to Choose. For those who are not old enough, like us old folks, Jacob,
speak for yourself. Speak for yourself.
Back in the 1980s, the fact is that the impact that this had throughout the United States could not be underestimated, because here was, for the first time in a very long time, an exposition of was basically why freedom works: individual liberty, the competitive market economy, the value and importance of the profit motive, the necessity for the government to leave people the liberty and discretion to follow their own courses of action, the importance and value of freedom of trade, and a whole other series of such issues. That third world development will be helped by the market and hindered by the heavy hand of government planning and intervention. This was immensely. He was articulate. He was persuasive. He had his own version of charisma, and then he would have guests at the end in like group discussions, pro and con, that would reinforce these things without the presumption that it's just his point of view. And then I should mention also one other point of his outreach in this is that from 1946 to 1966, the well-known free market journalist Henry Hazlitt had a weekly column in Newsweek magazine. But in 1966, Hazlitt retired from doing this. So Newsweek had to decide what to do. And so what they do, and wanting to be more, I suppose, to use the phrase now, the fair and balanced, they replaced Henry Hazlitt's own singular weekly column with the rotating columns of three other economists. Paul Samuelson, who was one of the leading Keynesian economists of the post-World War II period, Henry Wallach, who was sort of a middle-of-the-road pro-market economist, and then Milton Friedman. And then for another couple of decades, from the mid-'60s into the 1980s, maybe even the 90s, I forget when he stopped the Newsweek column, every third week were his analyses of what the government was doing and why it was disrupting things and how the market would solve these things. And several of these, several collections were made of these Newsweek columns. One of them is called "There's No Such Thing as a Free Lunch," meaning that government always costs and the market is better. And then, of course, then in 1976, he had won the Nobel Prize in economics. And that, of course, raised his stature both in the profession and increased the platform upon which he could publicize these free market ideas. He retired from the University of Chicago and then ended up at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, for which he continued to read and write and publish both serious and popular pieces until he died in 2006. I can only say in conclusion is that even if one does not always agree with the way Friedman went about his free market analysis, and I admit I'm saying that from my more Austrian economics hat, or even if one does not always agree with the particular form in which he tried to propose market-oriented reforms, which, as I said, has caused controversy among some libertarians, school choice and negative income taxes and monetary rules and so on. There is no doubt about it that his persuasiveness, his reasoning, his ability to clarify it in an everyday, commonsensical way, which the interested person can find on dozens upon dozens of YouTube videos of him from the 1960s and 70s and 80s and into the 90s, certainly in the 70s and 80s when he was at his high point of articulation in these things in popular crowds. He was one of the most important figures of the revival of free market and classical liberal thinking in the second half of the 20th century and now into the 21st.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary of Friedman. Let me amplify or add to a little of the things that you raised that I'm reminded of. You know, I've previously detailed how when I discovered libertarianism, I felt like these scales of indoctrination were just cracking apart, and I was seeing life as it really was. And one of the most shocking revelations was, you know, throughout our public school years, our college years, we've been taught that the Great Depression was caused by the failure of free enterprise, and that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal regulatory socialist program saved the free enterprise system. Well, then I read Friedman. Friedman says this is just nonsense. It was the Federal Reserve, this central bank involved in central planning of monetary affairs, that was the cause of the Great Depression. That was a stunner for me, Richard. I mean, that was when the scales were really cracking apart and I was learning about how life really was. Another thing about Friedman, you mentioned Capitalism and Freedom. I think it's in that book where he had the chapter on occupational licensure.
Yeah.
And that had a big impact on me because he's over there advocating the repeal of all licensure laws. Now, what are licensure laws? It's where the government gives you permission to engage in a certain occupation. It doesn't recognize as labor or liberty as a fundamental right that government can't interfere with. It's like your right to sustain your life is a privilege that we're going to give you. So you got occupational licensure and healthcare and law, shoe shine people, hairdressers. Friedman said they should all be eliminated. Let true free enterprise work. But he didn't pick the shoe shine person as an example. He chose the most difficult one as an example, and that served as a real model for me. He chose the medical profession because he figured if you can't show that occupational licensure is inappropriate in the most difficult one, well, then your case really doesn't make any sense. So he chose the medical profession. I highly recommend that essay to everyone to get a sense of why occupational licensure is so illegitimate. Now, let me address a couple of or recount a couple of personal episodes with Friedman. That, you know, we started FFF in 1990. Richard Ebeling was the vice president of academic affairs for FFF. I was the president. We were going through our first year, publishing our little monthly journal, and I write an essay called Letting Go of Socialism, in which I criticize vouchers, saying that vouchers are just another means of making the school's socialist system work. Well, lo and behold, Friedman is reading our little monthly journal and criticizes my position in a speech that's later reduced to writing. You can read it on the internet. It's called Letting Go of Intolerance. And he says, oh, well, you know, I agree with Jacob. And he even says the Future of Freedom Foundation is an organization that's doing great work. Now, here's a Nobel laureate. This was hot stuff, our very first year. And he's saying after about 9 or 10 months of our existence that we're doing great work. And he says, well, this is the way you get there with vouchers. I agree with Jacob that educational liberty is the ideal, the separation of school and state. And of course, I totally disagree with him that vouchers have more deeply embedded the state in the educational process. We've talked about that. But to Friedman's credit, at least he lets you know what the goal is. Now, I think it's ridiculous to think that more deeply embedding the state into the educational process is going to lead to educational liberty, and I think he's been proven wrong, especially like what's happened with Milwaukee. But at least he showed what the goal line was. And he did the same thing with the Federal Reserve. He wrote an article saying, well, I think there should be a range that the Fed should be constrained with in terms of money expansion, an annual inflation rate. But at least he put in parentheses, my ideal is to abolish the Fed. So to his credit, at least he did that. Well, in any event, I go to a Mont Pelerin Society meeting. I forget where. I think it was in Indianapolis. And I'm getting in the elevator, and lo and behold, there's Milton Friedman and his wife, Rose. And I said, hello, Milton, Professor Friedman. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He goes, Rose, this is the man that's doing the little monthly calendar book. I mean, it was just awesome. He knew who I was and what we did at FFF. And then later in the meeting, I saw him up at the bar. It was an outdoor setting, like a social event. And nobody was around him. So I walked up to the bar, and he engaged me in conversation, Richard, like I was the most important person in the world. He wasn't looking around, seeing who was more important. He looked straight at me, and we talked for about 25 minutes. He treated me so nicely, and I'll never forget that. Here's a Nobel laureate. No arrogance, no pomposity, just a plain old nice guy. So I think Friedman's one of my heroes. There's no question about it.
Yeah, I think that when the history of the revival of classical liberal ideas is written, let's say 100 years from now, whether we fully succeed by then or not, there is no doubt that there's an array of individuals who will be considered to be essential to the revival and the restatement of the ideal of liberty in its various personal, social, and economic dimensions. And besides, obviously, people like Hayek and Mises and Ayn Rand and others, up there in the pantheon of most important expositors and persuaders of the liberty ideal, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, will be Milton Friedman. He stands as one of the most eloquent and important and persuasive and personable advocates of liberty that we've seen in a very long time.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, but you know, you and I were both, when we first discovered libertarianism, influenced by the Foundation for Economic Education that was being headed by Reed and Opitz and the rest of the FEE staff. You ultimately became president at FEE. I was the program director there. But my recollection is in those early days of the Friedman that Milton Friedman had an article in there on rent controls. Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, what happened was that shortly after FEE was established in 1946, it might have been around 1948 or so, someone had commissioned under FEE's auspices that to have Milton Friedman and George Stigler, I believe it was with Stigler, write a piece on roofs instead of ceilings. That means ceiling meaning the height of the rent control. And the idea is that rent controls diminish the supply of existing housing and destroy incentives for any profitable building of new and housing. And there was some passage in this, and I apologize to the viewers and listeners for forgetting the exact thing, but there was something where Friedman and Stigler did not quite call for the absolute immediate abolition of these controls. And that did not fit in with Leonard Read's freedom philosophy that he was espousing at Fee. And so Fee, obviously under Leonard Read's oversight, inserted a footnote, an editorial footnote, that something about, that doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the publisher, the organization sponsoring it. I forget what it is. I have my copy of it somewhere on the shelf. I'd have to dig it out and actually look at it, which I haven't done in a long time. But Friedman was very upset about this. Friedman was very upset about this, that this editorial footnote, and it was clear that they weren't putting words in his mouth, like the little brackets in a footnote, and then it says dash editor, right, the publisher. So it was very clear that it was Fee saying this and not Friedman. But he was because I gather this was inserted without prior agreement or approval or notice. And it took quite a while for him to calm down and once again sort of become on an even relationship with Fee and Leonard Read. I have somewhere pictures that I copied from when I was Fee president from the 1960s and 70s. And what you do see is that, they were totally reconciled, because there'd be Friedman and Leonard Read, and I think there's one also with Hyde, and they're all together at these programs. So, but it obviously caused a high degree of tension at first that disrupted the relationship for a good number of years.
Well, it's a fascinating story, because it goes to show Fee's principled approach that had such a remarkable impact on me as well as you. So if for our newer viewers, the younger libertarians, if you've never seen Free to Choose, you can easily access it online. I couldn't recommend it more highly. It's one of those timeless series. It'll be as appropriate today as it was back then, and you'll learn a lot about economics and the genuine principles of a free market society. So on that note, we'll wrap things up, Richard. As always, greatly enjoyed the conversation about Friedman. Again, if you're new to FFF, subscribe to our FFF Daily. That's our daily journal, a commentary page, our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, that Friedman took me to task over about my article, Letting Go of Socialism. And we've got our YouTube channel. And come to FFF.org, buy my new book, An Encounter with Evil. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, I thank our viewers and listeners for joining us.
Yep, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.